What if Titanic didn't sink? What if Titanic hit the iceberg head on? Well, these are the kinds of questions that ship nerds like me ask ourselves all the time. And they're really good questions to ask because they present hypotheticals that can teach us a lot about the way these ships were designed and built. The truth is that Titanic, if she hadn't have sunk, was probably destined for a fairly quiet career. She might have seen service in the First World War, but beyond that, who knows? It can be a fun exercise to turn the pages of history back, copy other ships, and figure out what might have happened if things had turned out differently. Now, some of my favorite videos on this channel, and some fan favorites as well, have been when we've presented alternate realities, alternate universes where Titanic, where Britannic didn't sink, where Titanic hit the iceberg head on. We can learn a lot about what might have happened, and we can also learn about other ships that were similar that didn't sink, that had relatively, normal careers. So we thought we'd put these videos together for your viewing pleasure into a single presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and here are some captivating Oceanliner what-ifs. The Olympic class were designed from the outset as a trio of ships, as it was obvious that 3 massive steamers would be required to maintain a regular weekly schedule across the Atlantic. Titanic and Olympic were built side by side at Harland and Wolff, and it was Olympic which was completed first and sailed on her maiden voyage in June 1911. Titanic's completion was delayed thanks to a couple of Olympic's mishaps, including the collision with the British cruiser Hawke, but in April 1912 the ship was finished and ready for her maiden voyage. White Star Line gave Titanic the full PR treatment, and she was billed as both the largest and safest vessel afloat. Just as Olympic had before her, Titanic departed Southampton on April 10th, 1912, although with maybe less fanfare than had been afforded her sister. Even this wasn't without incident, however. As she sailed past, Titanic's wake drew in the steamer New York, and a collision was only narrowly averted. Some took this as an ill omen, and indeed it was the first of many similar misfortunes that would haunt Titanic for her entire career. The ship's maiden voyage went as planned, save for one incident on the night of the 14th, which almost ended in disaster. It was a moonless night and very still, which made it extremely difficult for the ship's lookouts to scan the water for icebergs. Approaching midnight, Titanic was at near full speed when her lookouts and bridge crew spotted a dark shape ahead. It was the ship's first officer whose actions prevented a collision, a Mr. William Murdoch, who ordered the helms swung over and the engines stopped. A few minutes later, there was a deep rumbling as Titanic's starboard bow hit and glanced off the iceberg, and the ship stopped dead in the water. Her skipper, a Captain Edward Smith, one of the White Star's veteran COs, conducted a damage assessment and found that the impact was only slight, and the ship's hull had only been grazed. After a half hour, steam was put back on and the ship resumed her voyage. It's been thought that if Murdoch had delayed a few more moments, the collision could have been much more serious. On Wednesday, April 17th, 1912, Titanic arrived safely in New York for the first time, although with a fairly obvious scratch along her starboard bow, which attracted much attention. Titanic and Olympic had successful seasons in 1912 and 1913, and there was a third sister on the way, Britannic. In 1913, Olympic went for a refit, which saw her receive a Parisian cafe like her younger sister had, and on completion she was actually bigger than Titanic. But instead of running the two sisters against one another, White Star Line simply referred to both of them as the biggest ships in the world. In February 1914, Britannic was completed and introduced to the lineup, and the Olympic-class trio was at last fully operational. The director of the White Star Line, Bruce Ismay, could see his ultimate shipbuilding dream play out. The company recorded massive profits, and the enormous Britannic, which featured more luxurious spaces than Olympic and Titanic, was hugely popular. Sadly, however, world events were to intercede, and this would be the only time the Olympic-class trio would sail together as conceived by Ismay and co. back in 1909. The outbreak of the First World War was a disaster for the Atlantic shipping trade, as it was for the rest of the world in general. and initially the Olympic-class trio was laid up before briefly resuming voyages with greyed-out superstructures. Finally, in 1915, the three were properly mothballed while the White Star Line discussed agreements with the Admiralty. First, Olympic and Titanic were converted to use as troopships. Titanic was placed under the command of Captain Charles Bartlett. She received a trio of 4.7-inch guns, with a forward pair firing both port and starboard on the forecastle, and one centrally mounted gun at the stern. Her lifeboat capacity and that of her sisters was boosted, with radial davits installed along the boat deck bulwark, and 10 additional 30-foot boats with collapsibles placed underneath. Her funnels were blackened, and windows and promenades along D, C, B, and A deck were blocked out to prevent light spillage. Olympic and Titanic were predominantly tasked with ferrying troops to the Dardanelles campaign and operated between Liverpool and Mudros, but by late 1915, casualties in Gallipoli had become so severe that there was a desperate need for hospital ships. Britannic, which was by then midway through conversion into a troop ship, was instead converted into a hospital ship, repainted white and placed under the command of Captain Herbert Haddock. Titanic followed suit in January 1916 and was recalled to Belfast for conversion. She returned to service in her all-white guise as the HMHS Titanic in mid-February of that year. Photographs from around this period show Titanic and Olympic both anchored facing each other in Mudros Harbour. Titanic's time as a hospital ship was marred with a number of small collisions and incidents, but ultimately she carried thousands in relative safety. In November 1916, Britannic struck a mine off the island of Kea and began to sink. Tragically, the ship could not be beached in time, and there was a struggle on board to lower the ship's boats from their well and davits against a serious list. Britannic sank in under an hour, and some 564 crew, nurses, and medical personnel perished. Titanic was again called back to Belfast for conversion work as the tempo of the war shifted, and she would again return to the Atlantic Ocean. 1917 was a crucial year for the Allied powers. The United States joined the war in April of 1917, and Titanic, along with Olympic, became tasked with crossing the Atlantic to ferry troops to the Western Front. To this end, Titanic received a complex dazzle paint scheme to disorient enemy submarines, as well as 4 BL 6-inch guns. Interestingly, however, Olympic received an additional pair in her forward well deck, which Titanic did not. Titanic's primary weapon during this time, however, was her speed, and she used this well, often sailing in excess of 20 knots. While Olympic encountered a number of German submarines during the war, Titanic did not. A periscope was thought spotted by the crew in late August 1917, although no torpedoes were reported, and Titanic escaped by sailing away in a zigzag. In May 1918, Olympic famously ran down and sank the German submarine U-103, earning the ship further accolades and solidifying her nickname, the Old Reliable. Titanic did have one shot at glory, although this too evaded her grasp. In July 1918, distress rockets were spotted fired off on the horizon, and an investigation revealed these to be fired from the small Cunard liner Carpathia, which had been torpedoed and was sinking fast. Titanic, which was empty of troops, approached to render assistance. However, the destroyer HMS Snowdrop had arrived on scene and signalled to Titanic with flags that the enemy submarine was still at large and she should depart. Titanic made steam, sailed away, and arrived safely in Liverpool. In October 1918, Titanic was involved in a collision with a collier, and her stem was fractured, causing her forepeak to take on water. This necessitated the ship be taken from service back to Belfast for repairs. So it was that on Armistice Day in November 1918, while Olympic was triumphantly moored in New York Harbour after her 28th trooping voyage, Titanic was moored at the Harland and Wolff fitting out wharf. It was something of an ignominious end for the mighty ship's wartime service, although she still had a role to play. Along with Olympic, Titanic began repatriating Canadian troops and did so through 1919. She never quite received the same welcome as did the Old Reliable, however. Regardless, Titanic had carried as many as 200,000 in safety through war-torn oceans and had travelled hundreds of thousands of miles. The 1920s was a decade of success for the White Star Line. The loss of Britannic had been a blow, but the introduction of RMS Majestic as a running mate to Titanic and Olympic saw the line once more gain the ability to boast of the largest transatlantic trio of liners in the world. While Olympic had her interiors modernised in the Art Deco style, it was decided that a point of difference be made between the sisters, and Titanic retained most of her original timber panelling and appearance. Because of this, they began to attract a different kind of customer. Olympic, the modern, younger, glamorous nouveau riche. The Titanic, the established and more traditional old money. And the Majestic, the ostentatious and the famous. Titanic's first-class amenities had always had an edge over those of Olympic, with many more luxurious first-class staterooms on her B deck. And in 1925, an additional pair of suites were added, each with their own private promenade, as the original pair had always been in high demand. Olympic received the same A-deck screens as her sister to provide additional enclosed promenade space, as well as additional staterooms on B-deck. Crucially though, both sisters' lifeboat capacities were permanently increased. Before the war, it had been thought by some that Board of Trade regulations had lagged somewhat behind the size of passenger ships and the volume of their passengers. However, the loss of ships during the First World War demonstrated the need for enough boats on board for all passengers and crew. Titanic and Olympic's boat deck bulwarks were cut away, and their boat decks lined with lifeboats for the rest of their careers. As the 1920s wore on, fortunes slowly began to shift, and the passenger numbers dropped. While Majestic was still a favourite, and Olympic was a close second, it was Titanic that suffered most. While Olympic appeared in a number of period films, Titanic only featured in two. One, a French example, has been lost to time, and the other was a 1928 flop comedy starring Eddie Cantor called A Night to Remember. On top of this, as always, Titanic was involved in a number of minor incidents and collisions, which frequently saw her returning to Belfast for repairs or replacement of propeller blades. Of note, in 1927, Titanic was caught up in an Atlantic storm so severe it smashed in the windows on her bridge and swept one unfortunate crew member to his death from the Monkey Island atop the bridge. The Great Depression only made things worse for the White Star Line, and it became abundantly clear that Olympic and Titanic would struggle to compete against the superliners under construction in Germany, Italy and France. In 1930, Titanic's central turbine casing was found to have a crack in it, and she limped back to Belfast for repair. Once there, however, it was decided that this would be the end of the line for Titanic. She was pulled from service, even though her machinery was still relatively sound. After 18 years at sea, the mighty liner made her final voyage to Rosyth, Scotland, and the breaker's yard. Olympic would follow suit in 1935, when she too would be scrapped at Jarrow. So there you have it, the fascinating story of a ship that had a brilliant, very fascinating career, but could never quite escape living in her older sister's shadow. It's really easy to think of Titanic today, in between all of her incidents and accidents during and after the war, as an unlucky ship. But it's well worth thinking back to the start of her career, way back on her maiden voyage, when she encountered that iceberg late at night. If the crew hadn't taken evasive maneuvers as soon as they did, it's not implausible to think Titanic could have hit the iceberg. And if she'd hit the iceberg hard enough, it's also not impossible to imagine there could have been some serious damage, enough to cripple or maybe even sink her. At that time, a ship being lost on her maiden voyage under such circumstances would have been unheard of. So it's kind of chilling to imagine what could have happened. It's early in the morning of April 15th, 1912. A slight chop has developed on the sea surface, but just hours ago, the ocean was a flat calm. The Cunard steamer, RMS Carpathia, has raced through the night to attend to a disaster. Now it has arrived on scene and prepares to take on passengers. In the night, the RMS Titanic, on its maiden voyage to New York, has encountered an iceberg, and in the pitch black of night, without a moon, it has collided stem on with the ice and has settled heavily by the head. Passengers begin to abandon ship to be picked up by Carpathia and other steamers which have arrived on site, alerted by Titanic's wireless distress calls. Titanic's complex watertight compartment system has held up, and the ship is not actually sinking, but the ship's bow has been crushed up to the foremast, and hundreds are dead. Of course, this is not how history transpired. Titanic didn't collide with the iceberg bow on. Instead, its crew attempted to turn the ship out of harm's way, and its side was open to the seawater, damaging enough of the ship's watertight compartments to sink her. But all the evidence is there to suggest that if Titanic had struck the berg at a 90-degree angle,
it would have survived, albeit with heavy damage and possibly hundreds of lives lost. It would have been a catastrophe for the ship's owners, White Star Line, but the Titanic would have stayed afloat. And here is why. Now, if you're anything like me, out of a morbid sense of curiosity, you might have Googled what would have happened if Titanic hit the iceberg head on. And if that's the case, then you've probably been subject to a lot of misinformation. On message boards and forums across the internet, self-proclaimed experts are perfectly willing to chime in with incredible stories of vast pressure waves that would have swept all the way up the side of the ship, opening up all the plate seams and popping all the rivets and sending Titanic to the bottom of the ocean in seconds, maybe minutes, killing everybody on board. But it's just not based in reality. Both history and physics tell us that that's not true, and the Titanic could have perfectly well survived the collision with the iceberg if she hit it head on. Titanic was designed to survive this kind of impact, and in fact, ships in general fare really well when it comes to head-on collisions with static objects. So today, let's unpack the history and the physics and find out why Titanic would have survived a head-on collision with the iceberg. First of all, let's go over the sequence of events as they occurred that night. In command on the bridge that night was First Officer William Murdoch, and so far it had been a peaceful, uneventful night until around 11:40 p.m, when he and the ship's lookouts in the crow's nest high up in the mast spotted a black mass ahead. It was an iceberg, and Murdoch had only seconds to act. Of course, it was his duty to avoid the iceberg by all means necessary. In a previous video, I explained how Murdoch tried to do this by porting around the iceberg, but it was just too late, and the Titanic sideswiped the berg and its fate was sealed. Now, I just want to point something out. This video is not asking whether or not Murdoch should have hit the iceberg head on, because the idea is completely ridiculous. He could never have known that Titanic would strike a glancing blow that would open up its side. He absolutely did the right thing, and to the very best of his ability. To assume in that moment that ramming the iceberg head on was the best course of action would have been insane and resulted in serious consequences for Murdoch after the collision. No, Murdoch's actions that night were totally sound, but the question still remains. Could Titanic have survived a head-on impact? Well, let's unpack some historical examples to see what happens in real life when ships hit icebergs head-on. As long as there have been ships, there have been things for ships to run into. It is a sad reality of maritime life. Ships are big, heavy masses of weight lumbering through the ocean at speed. It's hard to steer them out of danger, and even harder to slow and stop them. Because of this, there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of dramatic collisions from history. But believe it or not, Titanic was definitely not the first time a ship has had a nasty run-in with an iceberg. For example, the SS Arizona was a 450-foot-long, 5,000 gross registered ton ship operated by the Guidon Line. In 1879, the ship was steaming at its top speed, 15 knots, when it collided with an iceberg stem-on. The ship's bow was badly crushed up, but the ship survived the impact and sailed to Canada for temporary repair. Her bow was rebuilt, and the ship went on to have an almost 50-year-long career. The SS Grampian had a very similar experience. She had her own run-in with an iceberg in 1919. In fact, she was about double the size of Arizona and was sailing to Liverpool with 750 passengers when, in a fog, an iceberg was spotted dead ahead, and she contacted the berg bow on. 40 feet of Grampian's bow was crushed up, killing 2 stewards, but the watertight compartments held, and the ship did not sink. She too was also fully repaired and put back into service. How on earth did these ships survive these collisions? They both happened at a decent amount of speed and resulted in catastrophic damage, and yet both times the ships were recovered and put back into service. The answer lies in physics and engineering, and the way that ships are designed to break up when they encounter a static object, like an iceberg. One of the false claims made about the Titanic in a head-on collision scenario is that the force of the collision would be sufficient to send a shockwave of force throughout the entire hull of the ship, causing rivets to pop out of place, jamming the watertight doors and sending the ship to the bottom after breaking apart in minutes. But of course, as Grampian and Arizona demonstrate, this is just not the case, and here's why. Like today, ships of Titanic's era were mostly constructed of steel. A lot of steel. The hull was a complicated, honeycomb-like structure of steel beams, girders, and plates. All of these hundreds and thousands of individual pieces of steel were riveted together with millions of rivets. But here is the secret to steel's success. It's actually really soft. Not soft to the touch, of course, you wouldn't be sleeping on a steel pillow anytime soon, but it is flexible, and it can bend under pressure. This effect is called elasticity, the degree to which an object can bend or be deformed without fracturing and then return to its previous shape. This is really useful because ships, by nature, undergo massive amounts of stress as they sail over huge waves, so the hull needs to be able to bend and sag without breaking. But steel also offers a good degree of plasticity. That is, to say how much the steel can bend or be deformed permanently before failing. In a 1999 paper called The Mechanics of Ship Collisions, author and researcher Shengming Zhang does a spectacular job of outlining all of the forces at play when ships collide with static objects. You see, when a ship is moving at near full speed and it hits a static object, like, say, an iceberg, it begins to fold up by the bow. In Titanic's day, they referred to this as telescoping, and it's essentially exactly as it sounds. We saw this with the Grampian, the Arizona, and dozens of other ships from history. The bow of the ship, that huge honeycomb structure of steel girders, beams, frames, and bulkheads, suddenly begins to crush up. This is because, like I mentioned earlier, ships are huge and fast with a massive amount of forward momentum. When the ship collides with the iceberg, there is suddenly released a massive amount of energy. And all of that force has got to go somewhere. But where? Some would have you believe that the force of the collision is exerted on the entire ship's hull at once, causing failures all the way along. But we know that this isn't the case. You remember when I mentioned plasticity? Steel bends. It's not like glass, it won't just shatter. And as it bends, it absorbs an amount of force. Zhang's 1999 paper draws a direct relationship between the amount of building material employed in the ship's construction, that is to say, the sheer amount of steel holding it together, and the amount of force that the bow of the ship is able to absorb or dissipate as it is crushed up. And it just so happens that transatlantic ocean liners, like the Titanic, were designed and built to be extremely strong as they battered their way through the North Atlantic. Therefore, they employed an awful lot of steel. The effect of this force dissipation is enormous. Zhang calculates that a 150,000 deadweight ton tanker moving at around 18 knots would experience bow crushing of around 15 to 20 meters, or say 65 feet. But the ship would survive. The energy of the impact of Titanic's collision would also be absorbed by the crushing itself. Specifically, the effects of plastic tension, crushing, folding, and tearing as the bow broke up. It's not impossible to think that as Titanic's bow crushed in on itself and the ship was slowed from 21 knots to a stop in just seconds, passengers at Titanic's very stern would only maybe have felt a slight jar and maybe not even be thrown off their feet, as the bow's own destruction absorbed all that energy from the collision and brought the ship to a gradual stop. At one of the inquiries held after the Titanic's loss, one of the ship's main designers, Edward Wilding, took the stands and testified, saying, "I am afraid she would have crumpled up in stopping herself. The momentum of the ship would have crushed the bows for 80 or perhaps 100 feet. The commissioner of the inquiry was curious and he asked, "Your opinion is that the ship would have suffered that crushing in the first two compartments, but that the shock would have shattered or loosened the rivets in any other part of the ship?" Wilding responded, "Not sufficiently. As it would take a considerable length, 80 or 100 feet to bring it up, it is not a shock. It is a pressure that lasts 3 or 4 seconds, 5 seconds perhaps. And whilst it is a big pressure, it is not in the nature of a sharp blow." In fact, Wilding even cited the Arizona collision as evidence. "I believe the ship would have been saved, and I am strengthened in that belief by the case which your lordship will remember, where one large North Atlantic steamer some 34 years ago did go stem on into an iceberg and did come into a port, and she was going fast." Wilding was asked, "What you mean is that the ship would have telescoped herself?" And he responded, "Yes, up against the iceberg. That is what happened to the Arizona." In short, from the outside, Titanic would have looked in fairly bad shape. Impacting the iceberg head-on and at speed, Titanic's bow would have been crushed perhaps as far aft as the forward mast. The forecastle would have been gone, and with it the bunks and berths for the ship's 250 or so stokers and trimmers, the majority of whom would have been asleep at the time of the collision and would have been simply atomized as the bow crushed up around them. Structurally though, the Titanic would have been quite sound. Murdoch ordered the watertight doors closed before the collision, so they would have been safely shut, preventing widespread flooding. The forwardmost cargo hold would be lost, along with all its cargo, but crucially, the boiler rooms would be safe. So in theory, the ship would be still able to operate under its own power and generate its own electricity. If Wilding was right, and the first 2 or 3 watertight compartments were either destroyed or flooded, then Titanic would still have stayed afloat, because she was designed to stay afloat with 4 of her watertight compartments flooded. With the watertight doors shut, there would have been no way for the water to flood aft into the other compartments, and therefore Titanic could have stayed afloat. Captain Smith would then have ordered a distress call, and Carpathia would be the ship to answer. Smith would have organised an evacuation of the ship, and because the scene would have been much more calm and less frantic than the actual sinking, passengers would probably have boarded the lifeboats from the A-deck promenade. Once Carpathia arrived on scene, Titanic's lifeboats would have ferried the passengers off, while Titanic sat ominously low in the water with its forwardmost compartment flooded, but safe for the time being. Once empty of passengers, Captain Smith may have shored up the damage, perhaps with temporary wooden structures, and sailed Titanic maybe on to Canada, perhaps Halifax in Nova Scotia, where temporary repairs could be made before the ship could be sailed back to Harland and Wolff in Belfast, where for the next few months her bow would be totally rebuilt and she would be put back into service for the 1913 season. And that would have been the end of the story. If you're interested to learn more about the topic, I'll include some links to similar papers in the description of this video. But historic examples and real-world engineering tell us that yes, Titanic could have survived the head-on collision with an iceberg. She would have been in really bad shape. Hundreds could have lost their lives in the bow of the ship, but the majority of Titanic's passengers and crew would have survived that night and lived to tell a pretty extraordinary tale. It's July 1942, and the former White Star liner Britannic is steaming at full speed through a war zone. Aboard her are 7,800 troops destined for battlefields in North Africa. For days now, the ship has hidden from enemy submarines in rain squalls and sailed an unpredictable zigzag course, but now, on a dreary afternoon, the ship's luck has finally run out. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Now, few ships from history can boast of a career as epic and tragic as the RMS Britannic. The White Star Line's true pride and joy, Britannic served in 2 world wars and was once a favourite of the rich and famous in peacetime. In the 1920s and 1930s, she dominated the transatlantic trade, but few could have imagined that she would one day set the stage for one of the largest single losses of life at sea in human history. Britannic's story began with the conception of the Olympic-class ships, a trio of ocean liners that would work in tandem to carry passengers across the Atlantic in enhanced standards of comfort and safety. The latter part of that equation was shattered early on when in April of 1912, the second liner of the trio, Titanic, sank after striking an iceberg on her maiden voyage. Britannic was unfinished at the time of Titanic's loss, so construction was halted and she was partially redesigned. Her watertight compartments were mostly raised as high as B-deck, and she received a double hull, where, along the lengths of her boiler rooms and engine room, a watertight inner skin was installed. Aside from this, her lifeboat complement was vastly overhauled. Instead of the smaller Welland-type lifeboat davits, Britannic was fitted with enormous electric gantry davits which towered way over the boat deck and were designed to lower lifeboats even if the ship was listing way over on its side. Britannic would be far more luxurious than her sisters as well. Lessons had been learned from the operation of Olympic and Titanic before her. Where, in some cases, her older sister ships had been plain and Spartan, Britannic would be sumptuous and luxurious. This was most evident in the swimming pool, which on Britannic would feature magnificent green marble. Britannic also received a children's nursery and enhanced accommodation for second and third class. In the first class grand staircase was mounted a towering pipe organ, which was quite unique for the ship. But crucially, she was outfitted with more bathrooms for passengers. In first class on Olympic and Titanic, passengers were expected to use communal bathrooms out in the hallways. But on Britannic, almost every stateroom had its own bathroom, which was unusual for the time. Before Britannic could be completed, however, there was trouble, because tensions had finally boiled over in Europe, and the First World War had broken out. At first, the world's great liners were largely mothballed until decisions could be made on how to use them. Olympic was eventually put to work as a troop ship, and it was thought that Britannic would follow suit. But by 1915, the British had suffered horrible losses in the botched Dardanelles campaign, and they needed floating hospitals to take care of their wounded and safely transport them back to Britain. Britannic was ideally suited to this task, so her beautiful internal fittings were hauled away and kept in warehouses, and in December of 1915, the hospital ship Britannic sailed for her first wartime service. Britannic was painted all white for this role, as firing on a marked hospital ship went against the rules of war. Prominent red crosses and a green stripe were painted on her hull too, while up on the boat deck, large red crosses could be illuminated at night time, and a huge lamp could be lowered to shine on the painted red crosses on the ship's hull. In wartime, ships go to great lengths to hide their lights for fear of the enemy, but hospital ships rely on being recognisable as non-combatants. Britannic's public rooms were converted for use, and extensive hospital wards were installed in her promenade decks and large internal spaces, along with accommodations for doctors, nurses, and Navy personnel. The Britannic made 3 voyages to the Mediterranean between December 1915 and June 1916, when she was decommissioned and returned to Belfast for conversion into a passenger ship at last. But then this work was interrupted as well. Although the Dardanelles campaign had ended in failure in January of 1916, there were still many British troops abroad fighting against the Ottoman Empire in Egypt and the Middle East. So Britannic was again recalled into service and operated between Southampton and Greece. Her voyages at this time were largely non-eventful, except for a small incident in November 1916, when crew in the forward No. 2 cargo hold heard and felt a distinctive crash as Britannic collided heavily with something in the water. They rushed up on deck, expecting to have to evacuate, but found, strangely, that all was quiet. They reported this to the bridge, and lookouts at the stern were alarmed to see a mine bob to the surface. 2 months earlier, the German submarine U-73 had laid mines in the Kia Channel, where Britannic was now sailing. The ship had hit one dead on with such force that the mine's anchor chains were severed, so it floated freely to the surface. Fortunately for Britannic, the mine was inert and it failed to explode. After the war, when Britannic was dry docked for her refit, a deep indentation in her forward plating was spotted. It's thought unlikely that, given the safety enhancements made to Britannic after Titanic's loss, that a single mine would be enough to sink her, but it was still a close call regardless. In early 1917, Britannic was overhauled again, this time for a brand new wartime role. With Commonwealth troops in Canada now required to join the fight over in Europe, Olympic and Britannic and their rivals Aquitania and Mauretania were put to work on troopship duties, taking thousands of men over to the Western Front. On board Britannic, her hospital beds were replaced with steel bunks, and she was fitted with basic armament for protection. 3 BL 6-inch guns were mounted, 2 forward and 1 aft. Olympic received 4 of the same guns, but because Britannic had a large structure that was built for third class on her stern, she could only carry 1 gun there. When Britannic was rushed into service as a hospital ship, her aftermost set of gantry davits were not installed in time, but in 1917 they were finally fitted. Britannic also received a wild dazzle camouflage scheme intended to confuse enemy submarine commanders at a distance. The scheme was called the Type 18B dazzle scheme and made use of black, grey, olive, mauve and blue paint. She was certainly hard to miss. For most of 1917, Britannic made a dozen voyages across the Atlantic, dodging German submarines and relying on her high top speed for safety. For this reason, she never sailed in convoy or with an escort, and her engines were pushed to the max. Thanks to her more powerful central turbine, which was rated at 18,000 horsepower, Britannic could reach speeds of up to 24 knots. In 1917, her sister ship Olympic famously rammed and sank a German U-boat, but Britannic's trooping voyages were ordinary, save for one occasion when a periscope was thought spotted in the distance and some cursory shots were made to scare the enemy sub away. By 1918, with the United States having entered the war, Britannic marked her first arrival in New York Harbor. Not as a passenger ship, of course, but still, thousands turned out to see the massive liner arrive for the first time. By 1919, the war was over, and both Britannic and Olympic had survived the conflict, putting White Star Line in a good position to resume regular passenger services. But first, hundreds of thousands of soldiers had to be repatriated to Britain, Canada, and the United States. Olympic and Britannic worked hard side by side, and Britannic became a regular sight in Halifax. Of the two ships, Britannic was withdrawn from service first in August of 1919 for overhaul. Olympic, which had been hastily repainted in her civilian colours, would maintain an austerity service between Southampton and New York to lessen the impact of having two major liners out of commission for overhaul. At Belfast, finally, all of the magnificent interior fittings intended for Britannic back in 1914 were installed. The pipe organ, the green marble swimming pool. On the inside, slowly, the cold, steel, wartime interiors were transformed into the very height of Edwardian elegance. A critical change was also made to Britannic's engineering spaces, though. She was converted to oil-burning boilers, which were more efficient and reduced the size of her engineering complement from about 350 to just 70 men. The additional lifeboats on her boat deck, which had been fitted during the war, were removed, giving her a cleaner look, and in June 1920, into Belfast Lock steamed Britain's largest liner, a resplendent sight. After 6 long years, Britannic was finally complete and ready for her maiden passenger voyage. With Britannic in service again, White Star Line could capitalise on a post-war boom as millions were displaced in Europe by the war and sought to flee the economic carnage that was left in its wake. Olympic had to be refitted too, and she was actually more tired out than Britannic was, so she was withdrawn from the austerity service in 1920, and the older SS Adriatic was brought in to replace her. Britannic's maiden passenger voyage received huge press attention as it represented a major achievement for the British merchant fleet, which had suffered so terribly during the war. Britannic carried the name of the British Empire itself, and she was the pride not just of the White Star Line, but Britain. The blue ensign fluttering proudly from her stern, and with Captain Bertram Hayes in command, White Star Line's new flagship carried over 2,200 people in comfort and luxury to the New World for the first time. Arriving in New York Harbor, the turnout to see her was even greater than when she had first steamed there back in 1918. This triumphant moment set the tone for a big few years for Britannic. Her exemplary career as an ocean liner had just begun. By early 1921, Olympic had rejoined Britannic on the transatlantic service, and for the first time since the White Star's executives had dreamt up the idea of the 3 mammoth sister ships in 1907, the 2 remaining Olympic-class liners were at last providing a regular transatlantic passenger service. The 2 sisters would often pass at sea, the occasion usually marked with a close run pass-by and blasting of the ship's whistles. It's said that so many passengers crowded the decks of the 2 ships for these occasions that they would list over towards each other as they passed. Olympic and Britannic quickly developed a dedicated clientele, but it was Britannic, with her enhanced first-class accommodations and beautiful interiors, that became the favourite for film stars, the wealthy, and the general public as a whole. Britannic had carried the title as Britain's largest merchant ship, but in 1921, Germany's remaining liners had been acquired as war reparations by the British government, and White Star Line was able to buy the SS Bismarck at a discounted rate. Renamed Majestic, at last, 3 massive White Star liners were operating on the Atlantic. Majestic actually took 2 of Britannic's titles, the largest British merchant ship and also White Star Line's flagship. Accordingly, Commodore Hayes was transferred to the newer ship, but the introduction of Majestic meant the White Star offering now provided passengers 3 distinct flavours of travel to choose from. Olympic, the more austere, attracted the old money and the traditional. Majestic, the flashy and the ostentatious, but it was the Britannic that attracted the wealthy and the stylish. The 1920s were a period of great success for the White Star Line, but competition with their old rival Cunard remained high. Although they'd lost Lusitania in the war, she was replaced with Majestic's German sister ship, which had been renamed Berengaria by Cunard Line. They too could now operate a 3 superliner service, with Mauretania and Aquitania sailing alongside the newer ship. By the mid to late 1920s, though, the immigrant trade had begun to dry up, as the United States had imposed restrictions on intake, and then the Great Depression brought a killer blow. British industry was devastated, costs rose, and few could afford expensive transatlantic crossings. Even more worryingly, though, European rival shipping lines had begun to introduce newer and better ships which totally outclassed the old British liners. Germany with the new superliners Europa and Bremen, Italy with the Rex and Conte de Savoia, and France with Normandy. By 1932, Britannic's yearly passenger tally had dropped to just 12,000 from the 32,000 it had been in 1928. Britannic and Olympic were both put in for refit to try to attract a upper middle class passenger, with Britannic receiving a cinema and an extended dance floor. Corrosion on the gantry davits after almost 10 years of continual passenger service was found to be extensive, so they were finally removed and Britannic received a more conventional lifeboat layout that was similar to her sister Olympic, the giant gantry davits instead being replaced with Welland quadrant davits. The refits kept Britannic up to date with navigational practices too, as her old Marconi wireless was replaced with a newer set, and an early form of radio-based position-finding navigational aid was installed to work in conjunction with lightships and shore stations. The White Star Line had plans to introduce a new superliner to compete with their German, French and Italian rivals, but construction was halted by the stock market crash in 1929. Similarly, Cunard was working on their own supership, which too had to be halted when funds dried up. The British government here sensed an opportunity to consolidate the two rival companies and therefore focus the efforts of the transatlantic British passenger trade into one conglomerate. The government promised to fund the construction of one of these two superliners in the event of a merger, and in 1934, that merger occurred. But it was Cunard, thanks to the political manoeuvring of its chairman, Sir Percy Bates, and its close relationship with the British Admiralty that retained the majority share. The company was named Cunard White Star, and the old White Star Line's new superliner project was cancelled and scrapped, while Cunard's Hull 534 was completed, eventually becoming the Queen Mary. With the two companies consolidated, bookings were still at an all-time low, and there was simply just not as much need for that many liners, so the oldest would have to be retired and scrapped. First, in 1934, it was Mauretania and Olympic that were pulled from service, mothballed and sent to the breakers. Aquitania and Britannic were next on the list, but importantly, it was Britannic's high number of stateroom bathrooms, which meant that she was still an earner, so she was temporarily spared. White Star had intended to introduce a pair of modern, smaller liners to take over from Olympic and Britannic, in lieu of the cancellation of their superliner project. These two motor vessels were named Oceanic and Georgic. By 1935, discussions were being had about Majestic, Berengaria, Britannic, and Aquitania. Queen Mary was due for introduction in 1936, so there was just a surplus of superliners. It came down to basic economics. But it was Berengaria and Majestic that were suffering from electrical faults, fires, engineering problems, and even serious hull fractures, while Aquitania and Britannic were cheaper, more reliable, and more efficient to run. Instead of pulling the two older ships, it was Majestic that was first pulled from service in early 1936, followed by Berengaria in 1938. Aquitania was kept in service until the Queen Elizabeth could be completed by about 1940, while Britannic continued to maintain services supporting the smaller Oceanic and Georgic. But she too was due to finally be retired and scrapped. In July 1939, she was at last pulled from service after 25 years and laid up, awaiting destruction. But then, something happened. Tensions in Europe had been escalating since the Nazis rose to power in 1933, and it was the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, just 2 months after Britannic was laid up, that sparked the outbreak of the Second World War. Again, Britain needed to rely on its merchant fleet for salvation, and Britannic was saved from the scrapyard. Her engines were in fine condition. Triple expansion steam engines are famously simple and reliable in their function. On top of this, the Britannic's lavish interiors had already been stripped away and auctioned off, and converting her into a troopship again would be a fairly simple task. She was painted a dull battleship grey and covered in quadruple Vickers anti-aircraft gun mounts. At her stern, she was given a single QF 4-inch gun, with another mounted forward just in front of the foremast. With enough bunks installed for almost 8,000 men, Britannic's lifeboat complement would prove dismal in a disaster, so dozens of rafts, known as Carley floats, were mounted in quick-release cages along her boat deck and after promenade deck. The all-grey troop ship that emerged in December 1939 was almost unrecognisable as the once beautiful Britannic. In fact, she had even been renamed. In a curious position, because she had been awaiting a purchaser for scrapping, Britannic was actually bought outright by the British Admiralty and was crewed entirely by Royal Navy personnel. Accordingly, she was renamed HMS Resolute and put to war service. To combat magnetic mines, some ships received a degaussing cable, which was essentially a giant copper cable that wrapped around the entire length of the ship connected to its hull. Queen Mary received one of these, and you can clearly see it in photos from the era. But the process was expensive and complicated, so the fitting of degaussing cables was reserved mainly for capital ships. Instead, as she was an older ship, the Resolute would have her magnetic field altered by a process known as wiping. A large electrical cable would be dragged along the hull of Resolute by a smaller ship, which would temporarily negate magnetic mines. Resolute would need to be frequently wiped in this manner for the rest of her wartime career. The next few months saw Resolute sailing in convoys alongside her old rival Aquitania, carrying thousands of troops between England, Scotland, Canada, and North Africa. By late 1941, Japan had entered the war, and Resolute was employed alongside Aquitania, Queen Mary, and Queen Elizabeth in reinforcing Australia and Papua New Guinea. Transatlantic liners, however, just weren't designed for service in hot climates, and for the 7,900 troops aboard Resolute, the conditions were almost unbearable, and the ship's cavernous steel hull became something of an oven. Remarkable photos show Resolute moored in Sydney Harbour, a destination she was never intended to reach by design, but by 1942 she was returned to the Atlantic, all the while dodging German U-boats and aircraft. It was then, in July 1942, that her luck finally ran out. At 1:30 p.m. on July 16, 1942, Resolute was steaming without escort at speed off the coast of South Africa, bound for Simonstown. Aboard her were 7,780 men, predominantly from the 51st Highlander Division destined for North Africa. Unbeknownst to the ship's crew, however, her position had been monitored by U-boats lying in wait for British shipping off the coast. At 1:30, her zigzag course brought her perfectly within the sights of the Type 9 U-boat U-172, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Carl Emmerman. Emmerman fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at an almost perfect 90-degree firing angle. 2 of the torpedoes fell astern, but the 2 others found their mark. Resolute was dealt a crippling blow, with the first torpedo striking just below the 4th funnel in line with the engine rooms, and the second torpedo striking just aft of the mainmast on the bulkhead between 2 watertight compartments. The impact of the 2 almost simultaneous strikes was enormous, and all the safety measures taken in the wake of the Titanic disaster back in 1912 were completely overwhelmed. The inner skin could not hope to hold up against a German torpedo. Many of the engineers on watch at the time of the impact in the engine rooms were eviscerated, and the ship immediately began to take on an enormous amount of water. The automatic watertight doors were engaged by the bridge, but the jarring force of 2 torpedo impacts from the side jammed the watertight doors' rails for most of the compartments aft of the number 3 funnel. With no way to close them, the Resolute was now flooding uncontrollably, and the ship was doomed. Many of the troops quartered low and aft on E, F, and G deck were drowned in their bunks without time to escape, and the ship began to settle in the water quickly by the stern. There was really no time to organise an efficient evacuation, and thousands of panicked men swarmed the ship's upper decks as her stern began to dip into the water just 5 minutes after the attack. With her electrical generators flooded, the ship's interiors were darkened as the backup lighting kicked in, and many of the doorways and staircases were jammed as hundreds attempted to rush up to the boat deck. A few lifeboats were lowered as the crew attempted to regain control of the situation, but most of them remained attached to the ship as the bow began to rise into the air. Just 12 minutes after having been hit, Resolute's funnels began to collapse as water raced up the boat deck. A huge wave knocked men sprawling into the ocean as water surged inside, unhampered by watertight doors. It was only the forwardmost doors that had been able to close, so that by the time the bow was about 30 or 40 degrees up into the air, the ship began to sink slightly slower, giving the crew time to free some of the quick-release Carly floats. 19 minutes is all it took for the HMS Resolute, the former pride of British shipbuilding, to slip beneath the waves, taking thousands with her. When Resolute failed to arrive at Simonstown, a search was organised, and 2 days later, on July 18th, a short Sunderland flying boat spotted a clump of lifeboats and floats tied together. In all, 6,348 men were lost in a devastating blow. In fact, the blow to morale was so great that the true cost of Resolute's loss was covered up by the Admiralty, and few details were given to their next of kin until after the war. Britannic had one of the most fascinating careers of any ship, serving in 2 world wars and providing safe passage for hundreds of thousands of people. Sadly, today she is best remembered for her tragic demise, but I like to think back on those glorious days in 1921 when she was the very pride and joy of the White Star Line and the greatest ship afloat.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.